Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 6th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking ourselves, is there actually anything Russia can do to get control of this situation? And what can stop Ukrainian advances? Let's get into it. Okay, so when we look at the tactical map, you can see that, again, Ukrainian forces continue to refuse to allow Russians to establish a defensive line anywhere. Obviously, they have connected their bridgeheads from Dovorichna all the way down to Bilohorivka. This is significant because, of course, Bilohorivka, Hirovka, this was the far watermark, the high watermark right here at Hirovka, was as far as Russian forces were able to advance after they seized Lysychansk. And once Lysychansk fell, it seemed like only a matter of time before Russians would seize Hirovka and begin to march across the Seversky Donetsk. I'm trying to get these rivers right, guys. But, of course, Hirovka was defended by Ukrainian forces, and now we're actually seeing not just Russian forces fall back, but seeing a single offensive line of contact stretching. Really, it looks like probably around 1 to 200 kilometers across Ukraine, with no natural boundaries to stop Russia this time. And as we can see, when we advance the map, we could see that even some of the boundaries that I suspect Russia may have considered using, namely this major roadway here, Ukraine has pushed past these. And when we look, there's just not a lot of natural barriers for Russia to rely on to stop Ukrainian advances, especially because Ukrainian forces are more and more relying on mechanized warfare. They're relying on tanks, armored personnel carriers, oftentimes vehicles captured from Russia. But because they have access to these forces and their organization is improving, their skill with them is improving, whereas Russia is backfilling their casualties among tankers, especially with newly mobilized personnel who may have only a rudimentary understanding or recall of how to operate these vehicles, you may start to see a situation in which Ukrainian tank commanders and Ukrainian tankers are actually more skilled than Russian, which was, of course, not the case at all at the outset of this war. When we look a bit to the south, again, as we've talked about, Russia really just seems to have a problem with priority of effort. First, we can see that they are continuing to try to seize ground near Bakhmut. These are, trivial gains relative to what Ukraine has been seizing. And so it really makes it hard to justify why these things are happening. And we can be almost certain that this is not part of Russian military command. If the rumors are to be believed, if I were a betting man, I would bet that the units here are probably those subset of Wagner Group mercenaries who are paid by the kilometer, given bonuses for territory seized. There's no operational reason that the Russian military should be seizing meaningless territory. It doesn't mean that you can't go on offense when you are being attacked, right? Oftentimes that can be, it's called a spoiling attack in NATO doctrine. And what that would be is if when the enemy is aggressively attacking you in one area, you attack them, but in an area and at a target so significant to your enemy that they have no choice but to cease the attack and move forces to defend their target. You don't need to be a tactical genius to understand that Vesla Dolna, which appears to be a small cluster of, they're not even houses. It looks like a clinic with some outbuildings. This is not the essential target that will cause the Ukrainian army to cease its offensive operations. So again, it's the only reason I can think that Russia would put combat power into this is if there wasn't really anyone in command at the operational level. When we look even further south, we can see, again, continued Ukrainian gains as Russian lines are broken up in near Kherson. You can see Russians are retreating across the line of contact. If some of the rumors are to be believed, there's not a lot of command and control that they're still exercising. And this is what a rout would look like, right? There isn't a retreat is characterized by designated forces remaining in position and defending as other forces bound back and establish quality defensive positions, and then the other forces bound back. And at some point you reach your defensive line that you're going to remain at, right? Or you're going to transition to the offense. But instead we're seeing across the board, all units kind of retreating simultaneously. And that is a sign to me, or an indicator, that this is probably more like a chaotic rout. Where will Russia be able to settle? Where will they actually find a reasonable place to establish a defensive posture? Looking casually at the map here, there's, again, very few boundaries. This looks like an extremely flat region. Generally, you can tell blocky roadways like this and blocky fields are only done in areas that are almost perfectly flat. If there's elevation changes in the terrain, those tend to be those roads tend to wind a little bit more. So given that, I suspect that perhaps this river here may form the final defensive line for Russian forces around Kherson. Of course, this is just tactically a terrible position if that's where they end up. But I also want to point out that Ukraine has invested a lot in the preparatory phase, right? You may have remembered that before the Kherson offensive even started, bridges all across the river here were taken out. And that is really significant now, because look where Russian forces cannot be easily reinforced. And two, Russian forces have nowhere to go, right? So they are being pushed up against this river here, the Dnipro, right? They can perhaps retreat, to the west, but even here they may find themselves pinned up against geographic features, which can make it harder, right, to dig out and eliminate a retreating force. Sometimes you just want them to be able to run away and you lock down some territory. But if your goal is to reduce Russian combat power, isolating those units and then eliminating them is a very viable strategy. When we look at the Russian, we're going to call it the home front, we can see that there's been a lot of finger pointing. The finger pointing continues apace, and Institute for the Study of War is actually starting to think at this point that the fall guy for some of these are actually going to be Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense. This is a problem for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is that the Russian Minister of Defense is, well, the person in charge of the defense of the country. And kidding aside, when there are lots of people you could blame for this, this being Russia's defeat on the battlefield, their failed partial mobilization, in which, frankly, Russia was, in which Russian citizens are outraged that the Russian government said that, only people with prior military experience would be mobilized, and in fact it appeared to be that any able-bodied man was getting mobilized, and then some people who weren't really all that able-bodied. But if you blame your Minister of Defense, one, the next Minister of Defense is not going to want to be a part of this, is not going to want to take take the reins of a project that is 90% of its way to failure. But two, you can't. Who is the alternative to take over the lion's share of warfighting? It's not the Wagner Group. It's not Prigozhin, right? This is a guy who's known as Putin's chef due to the fact that he owns a bunch of government catering contracts. And like a lot of these oligarchs, they have their fingers in a lot of pies. But this is not a man who is a professional military commander, and it is a unique set of skills to be able to run a full Ministry of Defense, right? To take civilians and turn them into combat power on the battlefield, right? And it's a tremendous task, one that should be done by professionals. This is the equivalent of making like Eric Prince, the Blackwater guy, equivalent of making him like Supreme Commander of Allied Forces and also the U.S. Secretary of Defense. It's a bad idea for a whole host of reasons, right? He can't, for example, also make Kadyrov, who commands only Chechen forces and is regarded with, will generously say, skepticism by most European-facing. Yeah, you're like cosmopolitan. That's the word I want. Cosmopolitan Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg who view him as sort of an idiot, as we've discussed, and also a Chechen, which, you know, Russia and Chechnya, they don't like each other. But Putin may be gearing up for it because Kadyrov just received the rank of Colonel General. So Kadyrov seems to be, and these other Siloviki, the non-military force providers, seem to be ascending, and the Russian Ministry of Defense seems to be on the outs politically. You don't need me to tell you that this is really bad. I can't tell you how bad of an idea it is to take non-professionals and have them take over more and more of your country's fighting. It's just a recipe for disaster. The business of fighting it's hard for professionals to do. But when you're talking about 2020 warfare, right, you have to be an expert on information, on logistics, recruitment, retention, tactics, strategy, acquisition, contracts. This is not something you take a chef and give them a new hat. This is not something where you take some Chechen thug and give him a star on his uniform and have him do it, right? And this is a sign, if indeed Shoigu gets booted, this is a sign of really just like desperation by Putin. And the people that ultimately pay the price, of course, are going to be the poor Russian conscripts who are going to die for absolutely no reason. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. As always, as we've talked about in other videos, one, you can see that I'm on the road, but also YouTube is been a little bit aggressive with their demonetization. You can see that large numbers of my videos are have their ads pulled, meaning they don't make any money. A lot of my breakdowns, a lot of times YouTube is just refusing to review my videos. So, you know, if you guys want to see the uncensored, raw combat video breakdowns, they are on the Patreon. You know, those guys also do a huge part to support the channel. And yeah, it means a lot. So the link, as always, is in the description. And if you don't want to do that, you can always check out our sponsor, Ground.News. Ground.News is a great source. It's the source I go to for all of my news updates, because they let us see how the same story is reported across the political spectrum. We get to see who owns the media outlets, the bias, their commitment to factuality, and it really helps us see through Russian propaganda. So just checking those guys out. They're free to check out, supports the channel. Anyway, guys, I'll see you in the next one.